Chapter 15. I think on Monday you guys kind of talked about objects. I don't remember exactly which chapter that is, but you probably got into a little bit of, maybe the literal object syntax. You probably talked a little bit about that. Did you guys also talk a little bit about JSON? Maybe, hopefully, okay, because pretty important. Did he go over, say, like JSON parse and JSON stringify? No. Okay. So the short answer is, just so that I don't know that I'm going to use it today, but just so that you know, because it's something you'll want for the project that we talked about. So one thing in there's two methods you want to know. So there's the JSON object, there is a parse method, and there is a stringify method. Those are really the only two methods on that object that you care about. Okay. I might mention those real quick because, again, you want to know about. So what parse does is parse takes in JSON, takes in a JSON string, and returns an object. That's the important part. It can do more than that. For instance, if the stored data is an array, it will return an array. If it's an integer or other things. So it can be other formats, but we typically just use it with objects. So if you take the JSON for an object, that will parse it, turn it back. And stringify is the reverse. So it takes an object and returns a JSON string. Definitely put that in your notes. Those two things are really, really important. But that's really all you need to know about. Is this one we give an object and we get back a string. This one we give a string and we get back an object. So it's just the way that this comes in is it provides us a way to say, hey, I need to store this to a file or the database or wherever it may be. I can get that into a string because in a lot of contexts I can only save a string or pass a string around versus an object is more useful once we're programming. So we oftentimes need to transition between those two, and that's the quick way to do that. It's worth mentioning that this works really well when you're using this with the literal syntax where you're creating your own objects. Doesn't work well if you're, say, using classes and other things that may be in the system because it doesn't necessarily serialize other things like methods and inheritance. Does the what? Don't take a note of that. Just put up what I put there. Const is going to be depending on what you need. Okay. I intentionally didn't put const anywhere in that line. All you need to know is it's a function. Right? Okay. So sometimes there may be let, sometimes there may be const. It depends on your context. Okay. That I'm not saying that. Okay. Okay. See a few people writing some stuff down, but take a note of that because you will absolutely need that for the project, and it's a very useful pair of methods. Okay, so what I'm talking about today is chapter 15. So, and that does some of the things we want to do dovetail on what you did with objects because usually what we're going to have is an array of objects. It's an array containing objects, okay? And so that's the most common scenario. Arrays don't have to contain objects, they can contain anything, but that's the most common scenario that we run into, especially when you get into things in third and fourth semester, okay, the second year where I teach. This chapter is pretty extensive. It was written really as a sort of reference chapter. I don't think they really intended this as a way to like be given as a lecture. So there's a lot of stuff in here and it's pretty broad. In fact, the early level stuff is definitely like first semester stuff, like where you're at. Whereas the second parts of this, where it says like sets and maps, those are actually generally introduced later in curriculum, where you talk about like the data structures and algorithms course, which is either like a sophomore level course or a junior level course. So I won't be talking about sets and maps, just so we're clear. They are useful constructs. They are relatively new in JavaScript. Personally, I kind of know what they are and where they fit in, but I have not found a project where I needed them yet, okay, in terms of JavaScript. So they're not as important maybe to understand as the array. Okay, so what I want to focus on today is that array, and I think briefly I told Evan that some of the methods that we wanted to focus on in terms of array are things that you guys had ended up making a lab sort of about. So on the array, there's a few new methods, one of them being map, one of them being filter, there's a find, and also I might mention that there's a push. Okay, so I really want to focus on talking about those four because they're applicable to a lot of different problems that you write. So we'll kind of talk about what those are, what they do, why they exist, and maybe do some examples with those four. So I'll look a little bit about what the slides are, but these are mainly the things I want to do examples with. Cool? Good? Okay. So let me shut this light down here in a minute. Yeah, we'll kind of skip around through the slides. I'm going to go ahead and I think I meant to share a link to these slides so you could pull them up yourself too. Anyone? So I'm going to toss a link in Discord to these should you want to look at them locally. That way you can pull these slides up. Again, I'm not going to go over all the slides. I'll be skipping through and talking about just the stuff that's kind of most relevant. So you've probably done a little bit with arrays already, right? And so this is just kind of a deep dive into some other things that are there and some refresher. So let's jump down to here. So syntax for creating an array. JavaScript's been around for a good number of years now, right? I think the first version of JavaScript dates back to mid-90s, if I remember right, and the Netscape team, the Mozilla team. So these have kind of been in the language, arrays have been in the language for a long time, and there's been some evolution with that. And so part of that comes with, there's a bunch of different ways to create an array because you're supporting a bunch of different paradigms. JavaScript being kind of this multi-paradigm language where you can code in whatever style or whatever paradigm you want. So there's actually 3 different ways right now to create an array in JavaScript. And I might want to kind of call these out and take your attention to them. So the first way we can create an array is by saying new array. New array. Don't worry too much about the stuff on the right because the stuff on the right is not as important. Yes, we usually say that to a const array. It doesn't have to be that way. So I say new array, and here I say how long is it. So if I use this first version, what I'll get is an array that has a certain length. So I can say new array 5, and I'll get an array of 5 elements. Okay. Now, all of those elements aren't going to start with any values in them, right? There's going to be no values in those 5 elements. So let me kind of erase here and look at what we're talking about. So if I say const r is equal to new array 5. Now I've got an array of 5 elements, but if I then go start to read what's there, let's say I go, let's try to read what's at R3, right? That would be the 4th index, the 4th item. What am I going to find in this slot?
You haven't populated the array.
I haven't populated the array, but it's going to return something because it always has to give me a value back. So in some, it's worth mentioning in some languages, things like this, some things might throw an exception. There might be different ways that things behave. JavaScript's a little bit different on how this works than other languages. You got a hand up?
Yeah, I'm saying, does it return undefined?
Yes. Yes. So if I go immediately turn around and ask for array 3, I'm going to get undefined because, yes, I haven't populated it. Does that make sense? So this is going to turn around and give me an array. It is going to give me the undefined. I could change that. I could say, okay, let's start to put a value in there. And so maybe I put test in there. And then if I try to read it again, then I'm going to see that it says test. Okay. So I have to kind of put a value in there first. Otherwise, it's just going to say undefined. Okay. Now, so this syntax is really helpful if you, this is one that we use if we know ahead of time how big the array needs to be. If for some reason I know how big the array needs to be from the get-go, I can say I just need an array this big, and then I'll go do the work of populating. This comes up really commonly if I'm copying an array. If I'm making a copied array, copying it from one array to another array, well, I know that the copy needs to be the same length or a relative length. Maybe it's one bigger or one smaller or whatever that may be, but I know the size of the array, and so forth. This makes sense. Hear me? So that's the only case where we use that first option, is if you know how big the array is going to be, okay, to get from the get-go. Second syntax, array.of. We can use this syntax to also create an array. This one's kind of weird, okay? This one's kind of weird. So let's say I want to create an array using that syntax. Const r, maybe I call this colors. The way this version works is it looks like this. Of, and then I can pass in some values. So maybe I say red, green, and blue. So that's going to create an array of length 3 with the strings red, green, and blue. Fairly simple. Okay. This kind of exists because it comes from sort of a more functional world, where if you're maybe familiar with languages like Lisp, they kind of create some arrays or things like that that using syntax is maybe similar to this. So this kind of comes from a more functional world. Honestly, I never use that syntax, and I don't think most developers do. That's kind of a legacy of a bygone era, where I don't know that there's any real reason that you would ever want to use that. Okay, because here's what we can do. We can use that third syntax. Third syntax says, let's use square brackets to create an array. I can do the very same thing doing this. Say square bracket, red, green, blue, and I get the very same array, right? So I can use the array of and the square bracket array literal syntax literally to do the same thing.
So let's we want to put
Well, it's the instead of array of, it's just square brackets. That side, what's on the left of the equals doesn't matter. It's the same, right?
Okay.
It doesn't matter how I create the array. All that changes is what's on the right side of the equals, right?
Square brackets have the same value
as saying array of, right? So both of these really do the same thing. And I would always recommend doing the latter. I would always recommend doing this over array of. Okay. Again, JavaScript's been around for a good number of years. It used to be, in fact, that this, I remember back coding in the 90s when I started coding JavaScript. Actually, it was, I think, early 2000s starting to write JavaScript. This is the only syntax we had, is this first option. That's all we had. So these other things are kind of newer per se. So this is what I would steer for. The one gotcha and the one reason why this may still be there is that you still have a function here. Array of is still a function. So if for whatever reason you needed a function, which does happen sometimes, then that could be useful. But again, large in part, this is the syntax you want to know. In fact, most cases, array literal is the only way that we create arrays. We very rarely use the other two. Like even this, as I said, that's only if you know how big it's going to be. Okay, this is preferable when you don't know how big it's going to be.
It works up to 5.
Yep. You said what?
You said it works up to 5.
Well, I'm saying this is 5, but that number could be anything.
Oh, okay.
You had a hand up? Okay. So does that kind of make sense so far in terms of your options of creating arrays? So again, those are out there. You can do all the work with this one though. That will suffice for, I think, all of the things that you want to do, even through the 4th semester. Yep. You have to speak up. I can't hear you. But you got to keep your mask on.
It's for the color between colors and equals. That's what we got the master filters and everything else.
No, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And you cover your nose. You had a hand up? Okay. Okay. So that's the kind of starting point of how do we initialize things. Let's see. Okay, so there they show some examples of kind of what we just talked about. So here they're creating an array. This one's kind of weird, and I would avoid doing this because you'll notice if you just pass one element, it's the length of the array, and okay, they say if they pass multiple, then it's different than it's the elements. I would really avoid doing that. This is dangerous. So we talked about our indexes, right? You've probably already seen this. Things to remember is array indexes always start at 0. So 0 is the first element within the index, within the array. And so that means that the last element, if 0 is the first, then for this one, 4 would be the last index. It's always 1 less than the length. So it starts at 0, goes to 1 less than the length. Those are important things to remember. With most languages, if I were to do something like access that, okay, that would generally throw an exception because it would say, oh, it's less than 0, throw an exception, crash your program because this can't go forward. You have a problem in your code. You must fix that problem. Okay. JavaScript says this is okay. JavaScript says, okay, I'll just give you back undefined because I don't have a value there. Does that make sense? So it's actually legal to do that. In fact, it's also legal to access things after the array. So I could even go all the way up to 10, which would be the 11th element. That obviously doesn't exist. If I try to read either of those, I'm going to get undefined. Okay? I'm going to get undefined. It's also worth mentioning, it's legal to do this. JavaScript will complain about neither of those things. It won't tell you you're wrong. It will just go on and do its thing, okay? So in fact, I can say, okay, let's say that array -1 is A. If I then try to read it later, it'll actually read out as A. Same way with this one. If I try to write at index 10 and then read it back later, it'll say, yep, here's an index 10, it's B, right? So where most languages would throw an exception if I did these things, this doesn't. JavaScript doesn't.
What happens if you like try to iterate something with -1?
That's a good question, right? So if I try to iterate, if I've done this, I can actually iterate through the array. I could go from -1 up to, well, index 10. I could go look at all those indexes. So I'm going to find at index -1, we've got A. At index 0, it's still undefined. Index 1 and 2, those are still undefined. If I go to 3, I'm going to see test. And then between 3 and 10, I'm going to actually have a bunch of gaps, okay? So what happens when I do something like this is JavaScript says, oh, the array's not big enough to hold 10, right? So it just makes the array bigger. It just says, okay, I need space now to hold 11 things. So it'll change the length of the array to 11, which means that you have 3 is set and 10 is set, and then you've got all the gaps in between them. So like 6 and 7 and 8, they're undefined, right? But they're there. Does that make sense? So in fact, just doing this has doubled the size of the array. Doubled the amount of memory it's using. It's worth noting. So -1's kind of interesting. How does it deal with that, right? Well, it can. Suffice to say what's behind the array is not exactly an array in our conventional syntax as far as most languages would go. In fact, there's one structure in here that I didn't mention that I wanted to use. It's called a map. There's actually a map behind the array that implements this. And so that map is part of like what does this sort of weirdness where you can deal with negative indexes. Now, even though you can do this, I generally don't want to do that. I generally don't want to put things at negative spaces because, yeah, it makes iteration really weird, suffice it to say. Iteration gets really interesting when you put things at negative elements as well as looking at length. It gets really interesting. Yeah. Well, if you did a for of or for in loop, for in would give you these indexes. It would give you a -1, it would give you a 3, it would give you 10. Those would come out in the for in. Same with the for of. If I did a for of through this, I would get a bunch of undefined, but I also get test in A and B. I would get to those elements with the for of. So it's part of why that exists. Okay? So that's kind of interesting, right? The big thing that's different there with JavaScript is that it doesn't throw exceptions when you use invalid indexes, which is different from almost every other language out there. But we exploit that. It's very helpful, and it's something that we frequently exploit, okay? So that means I can do things like, let's say I start with an empty array. I'm going to erase a lot of this stuff here and change it back. In fact, I can probably go ahead and turn this light on since I'm just on the whiteboard right now and not on the screen. So let's say I make an array, const people, and I'm going to start with an empty array. Start with nothing being in, which is a really common starting point. Is we start with being in. I'm going to then say let's add something to it. So I could say people 0, okay, and set that to an object. Let's say, hey, first is Paul, last is Smith. So I've just created a person object. He's got a first name and a last name, okay? And so you can see those two properties. And now I've saved it back to people0, okay? So now people0 contains an object. If I ask for it again, if I read that, I'm going to find that same object, okay? What's the length of the array now? It's 1, right? So I've added something to the array, okay? Let's say I goof things up and I wrote 10 instead here. How big is the array?
1.
Close. I didn't hear the right answer yet. How big is the array? Remember, the last index is always 1 less than the length.
9. That's what I said.
It's 11. The index is 1 less than the length. So if the index is 10, the length is 11. Okay. So this makes an array. We just increased it from size 0, from length 0 to length 11. I don't want to do that accidentally because now I've got 10 spaces that are storing undefined, right? So, okay, right, that can be a problem. So if I'm careful about it, right, I could do something like that. But I really don't want to write a number in there because it's just so easy to fat finger things like that. It's so easy to fat finger a number and put the wrong number in there. If you start writing this and duplicating this, you say, okay, people 1, people 2, people 1, and then sometimes you find yourself saying people 1 and setting it twice, and you don't get the intended effect. So I don't usually want to explicitly put a number there. Okay, what could I put there instead?
You could maybe push it and append it to the array.
Which I'm getting to, but what could I put there instead in the index? Huh?
Get a count variable.
Some sort of count variable? But what if I forget to update that count variable? Okay, so one of the things to remember is that arrays have a built-in counter. It's called the length, right? Arrays have a built-in counter. So it's much safer, much safer, even for simple examples, to say this is people dot length. And set it the same way as there above. Yeah, so this ensures that I'm taking whatever the current length is and putting it there. Okay. So the length right now is what? The length was 0 if I put it in there. Once I've done this, length is 1, so this would go to index 1, etc., etc., etc. So it's much safer to use the length of the array here than say like 0, 1, 2, etc. Cool. Very good with that so far? Okay. And that also means I can repeatedly do this. I can say add it, add it, add it, add it. And I don't have to worry about keeping a counter anymore. Okay, because the length is my counter. And the length is more accurate and better than my counter would be. Okay. You also mentioned something about push, and this is part of where that comes into. So another way that we can add something to the array is we say people dot push. Now this syntax is a little bit different. I put the object here and push it onto the array that way. That will add something to the end of the array. Okay. So push is equivalent to doing this. Push is equivalent to the thing right above. Difference being here, notice I have an equal sign. I'm saying assign it to this array index. Here I'm calling a method on the array and passing it as an argument. So there's no assignment here. There is assignment here. So the syntax is significantly different. Okay. Both of these are preferable to the first, and usually we go with the latter. Usually I'm going to go with push, again, to shorten the code and make it really obvious what I'm intending to do. Cool. So that's the whole purpose of push. Push puts something at the end of an array. Questions? So it's a good way to populate things. You may have different things going on with the UI. Maybe the user is adding things to a shopping cart or a to-do list or whatever it may be. I can quickly add things to it. Okay. And I think, have you guys talked about what your project for the end of the semester is yet?
Not yet.
Okay. So long story short, just to give you a teaser, I think the plan is to do a bug tracking. And so like, this would be, hey, I want to add a bug to the array of bugs, right? When I create a new bug, I'm going to push it to the end of the array. Cool. Questions so far? Does that make sense? All right. So let's look at what's next on the slides, but I'm probably going to skip over to something else. So they've looked at that, length, delete. I might mention something real quick here, which is kind of interesting. JavaScript has a keyword delete. Delete is not the same as what it is in, say, C or C++. Okay, delete in C or in C++ means to destroy something. Delete is a little bit different in the JavaScript syntax. So one of the things I can do is I can say delete. I would say maybe people. And what that would do is it would remove the element at index 3, leaving a hole where it's undefined, actually. Yeah, it removes what's in the place there. Now, depending on the scenario, that may mean if I've deleted it that it doesn't get covered by a for-in or a for-out. So oftentimes this can mean that for-in and for-out skip over it because, like, okay, I know there's nothing there anymore. Like, you didn't intentionally put undefined. There's actually just like not supposed to be something there. It doesn't change the length of the array, is worth noting. Delete doesn't change the length of the array, but you can use it to remove indexes. It's generally not what we use, though, just so we're clear. And because it doesn't adjust the length, it creates a hole. It's usually not what we're going to use. It is really helpful with objects, though. So let's say I have a person, and I've decided, let's say I have a person, and he's got some sort of salary information in there. I might want to say, well, I don't want to show the salary information or the password or whatever it may be. And so I might say salary, I might delete that. That is much more helpful. So delete generally happens with objects, even though you can do it with arrays. And so this would remove the salary field from the person object. So one thing I wanted to mention here, I forgot before we left. If I want to say access this person's properties, okay, the way I'm going to access that is I would say people, remember that's the name of the array. We say the index, so this would be people 0, be the first thing in the array, dot first. That would be, if I wanted to access that property, I need to say, start with the array, go to the index, and then look at a property. So you're going to see this pretty common. We kind of do this sort of pattern all the time. And the way to kind of think about it is this is an array, this gives me an object, okay? This is an array, that's an object. Okay, if I have an object, I can access properties. Cool. You almost think of it as like there's parentheses around this first part. Okay. So I can access that. If I want to access the last, I can even go in there and say, set those values. So if I decide that, okay, your first name has changed, I could do people 0 first and change that name to, say, John. That's legal. Cool. Okay. We do a lot, again, we do a lot of that. say, okay, I want to assign a read or write a value of an object that's within the number. In fact, I've often seen things twice as long as that. Because sometimes you have an array that contains arrays and contains arrays, and you're going to go further down the rabbit hole there. Okay. So let's talk about loops. Okay, so I'm going to start with, let's go back to colors. Red, green, and okay, I'll start with that. Sounds like you've learned a few of the loops, right? So you probably learned that in JavaScript, there's a few kinds of loops. There is a while loop. There's a do while loop. There is a for loop. There is a for in loop. There's a for of loop. Okay, so JavaScript really has 5 different kinds of loops. Okay, all these technically can be used to iterate over an array. Okay. You could use any of those to technically iterate over an array. It's going to look a little bit different depending on what loop you use, okay? But you can use any of them. So let me just throw that out there first, okay? So one of the things to kind of keep in mind is, well, okay, I can use these 5 options. Which one should I use, right? Which one should I use given that I have all these options that can do the job, okay? There are some things you have to watch out for. For instance, remember, do while always goes once. So you do have to ensure that there's at least one element in there before you start do whiling over it, making sure it's empty. But large in part, we don't use these, okay, because they work much better when you don't know how many elements you have. Both while and do while work much better if I don't know how many elements are coming, okay, or if I don't have an array, okay, because these, all 3 of those work much better in general when we're looping over arrays. Good with that? Okay. So I want to go through those 3 and talk about what is the syntax for them and what are some of the pros and cons for what those are, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first one is what I often call the counted for today, okay? Because we've got for in and for of and for, I kind of need a different name to call that, so I call it the counted for. So counted for, I'm going to say let's let, we've got an index, so the index is going to start at 0. We're going to start at the first element generally. I'm going to say index, as long as index is less than colors dot length, we're going to keep going, and we're going to iterate 1 element at a time. This syntax has been with us for a very, very long time. Any version of JavaScript understands this syntax. And it's kind of originated back in the days of C. And so basically anything that's based on the C language, C, C++, Java, C#, JavaScript, all of these languages include this sort of syntax, okay? So it's a really good syntax to learn, partially because you can use it in so many different languages. Also because it works for anything, okay? There's literally nothing that this loop can do. In fact, any case that you might need a do or while loop, this loop can also do, okay? This can literally do everything, okay? So it should be your best friend. It should be one you memorize and you know really, really well, okay? It's also not necessarily the one you use the most often anymore. Okay, so does that sort of the header make sense so far, right? Things to remember here is this is a less than, right? It's less than because I don't want to go to the length, okay? Remember that it's always the last index I want to go to is one less than the length. So as long as I say less than, it won't go to, if the length is 10, it won't go and look at index 10. It'll just stop in index 9. Cool? Okay. So a common thing you might want to do is, let's just say we console log what we've got there. So console.log, and I could log the index, and I could log the element at that index. Okay. So if I did this and ran this, we would see, okay, it would print out 3 lines, 0, red, 1, green, 2, and blue. Everybody good with that so far? Okay. So this works. Okay, and again, this has been around for a very long time, and it will cover your bases. Okay, it's worth mentioning that this is, if you're trying to target old versions of Internet Explorer still, say version 6 through 8, this is the only syntax that's supported. Okay, this is the only one that's really been around for a long time. Both the for of and the for in are newer syntaxes. Okay, so they only work with modern browsers. The good news with that, I don't worry about that too much because there's this really nice thing called Babel, which will turn the other ones into something Internet Explorer. Okay, so that's the first one. I'm going to create some right over here. Maybe I'll just write it underneath if I can write it small enough. So another way that I can write this is maybe using a for in. So a lot of times we'll look at this and we'll say, okay, well, there's a lot of stuff here I repeat, right? I pretty much always start at 0. I usually want to go through all of the elements in the array, and I usually want to step one by one and catch all of them. So why are we writing that every time? If that's what we want to do most of the time, why don't we just make a shortcut for that? And so that's where for in comes in. So for in says const index in colors. And I can do the same thing. Console.log, log the index, and log the element. Colors index. Cool. Same thing. This is just a shorthand for that. Because we do this particular loop so often, we've got a shorthand here that avoids us fat fingering. Right? It avoids you doing typos. It also actually just makes this easier to read. Because one of the things to remember is that not only are you writing code for kind of the computer, you're also writing it for other developers that have to read it and check that it's correct. It's very easy to check this is correct, right? It's very, very easy. I say, okay, const index and colors, I know what you're doing. This, I have to check that every little piece of this that you've done it right, okay? If I set this to const, it's not going to work because you're reassigning it at the end. If, you've got a name, okay, I've got to put this name, index, index, index. If I misspell just one character in any 3 of those parts, code doesn't run, right? If I use the wrong comparison here, if I say less than, if I, instead of saying less than, I say less than or equal to, or greater than, I have to check that any code I'm reviewing, I have to check that that's not wrong. Okay, so you're seeing there's a lot of points of failure. right? I also have to check that you're starting at 0. And if you're not starting at 0, well, then I need to ask, why are you not starting at 0? Sometimes there's a good reason for that, but that needs to be explained, right? If you're not stepping one by one, maybe you're stepping by 2s or 3s, we kind of need to explain that. So typically the scenarios where, like, the problem is there's just so many knobs you can turn here that if they're not turned the right way, you get a different behavior.
Is there a difference between the post index and the next post parse?
Yes. Long story short, yes. So they're what we call post increment versus pre-increment. Okay. Post being when you put it after. Okay. Make myself some space here. So let's say I do let x is equal to 3. Okay. Here's where it comes in. So if I say y is equal to x plus plus, it's at the end, so we call that a post increment. Okay? Call that a post increment. Okay? Post meaning coming after. Okay? It actually means post in two senses. After in the sense that we write it after, but after also meaning that it comes after, it is executed after, right? So in this case, the value of y is going to become 3, which is maybe not what you would expect. In this code, y becomes 3 and x becomes 4. Okay. The reason that happens is with a post increment, the increment happens after the line executes. So you run the line and then increment it. So I first say y is equal to x, and then I increment x. So if you're doing post, it's kind of like post increment kind of looks like this. You say, okay, do that, and then I say x is equal to x plus 1. That's how the post works. Okay? Now pre, if I do pre-increment, that would look like that, where I put it before, okay? When you do a pre-increment, it happens before the line executes instead of after the line executes, which means that we do the increment first and then assign it. Does that make sense? So in this case, if I do pre-increment, it actually looks like x equals x plus 1, and then y equals x. I'm flipping the order of those two lines. Do you see the difference? Okay, you see the difference. So it matters, and it matters pretty heavily. It matters so much that the general recommendation today is that you should really avoid doing either these plus plus or the whether it's a post or pre, you generally should avoid doing that on the same line as anything else. That's the safest thing to do. The safest thing to do is to never do these things on the same line like I just did. Because if I write the code instead, something like let x equals 3, and then I do plus plus x, let this behaves the same way as regardless of whether it's post or pre. Because here I'm incrementing it and there's nothing else happening. Does that make sense? So it's generally recommended that you don't do that mixed in with other things. Sometimes that's kind of unavoidable, or sometimes that's used as sort of a shorthand, but generally we want to avoid doing it on the same line. Everybody good with that? Cool. So if I explicitly spell it out this way, then I know it's going to happen. Similarly, I can do let x is 3. If I wanted it to happen afterward, right? So I can do it before or after, not trying to combine it into one line. Do a bunch of things on one line. Okay? Cool? Okay. So that's why it matters. But that really doesn't have much bearing here. Okay? So I said what matters is that it happens before or after the line. Okay? The way this compiles, this is a line of code, this is a line of code, and this is a line of code. Okay? These are not all the same line of code, even though on your screen they look like the same line of code. You good with that? Because when it compiles, it's going to kind of move around, turn it into a while loop. This will actually go to the end of that while loop. Okay? So it's not actually going to be on the same line. So I just said, if that's the only thing you're doing on the line, it doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter. Not a lot. Okay. There's one gotcha. Pre-increment, post-increment. One of these is ever so slightly faster on the hardware. One of those is ever so slightly faster. This one. That is slightly faster on the hardware. It's usually so slight that you don't even notice. It's usually so slight that it won't come out in your measurements, because usually your database, how much time it takes to contact your database or other files or things like that, completely overshadow any performance benefit that you get by doing this. But it's so slightly faster, so that's why I use it. Cool. Interesting thing to note, interview questions often involve doing, when you're going out in interviews, you often will find yourself doing whiteboard problems where you're writing some code on the board and kind of having to come up with things on the fly. I have this habit, and I've had this habit for years. I always get asked about it on interviews. And it's always a great discussion, because I can always go through and explain, this is what it is, this is how it behaves. I can't tell you how many times it's helped me on interviews, talking about that little thing. Right? Because it's one of those things that, if you're a newbie, you don't know, right? And you don't really pay attention to. And so when I tell my interviews about how all that behaves, like, oh, okay, you know what you're talking about. Great. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. Right? So it's a little thing that doesn't make, it's mainly for performance, but it's also just a habit too, in terms of interviews, that I can say, okay, you know what I'm talking about, right? So, little tidbit there. Cool. But generally it doesn't matter if you're doing index plus plus or plus plus index, but I always do plus plus index. And I've done that for years. All right. So back to this. The reason here is this is really just a shorthand for that long thing. Everybody good with that? It's really just a shorthand. And it's there to avoid all of the common errors that people usually get into. Okay? So it's generally recommended to use that where you can. Yep?
So the only reason you would ever go back to the normal for loop would be to increment by more than just one, or to start at another number.
Yes. If I wanted to do something weird, right? If I wanted to do something weird, I would go back here. And that means if I wanted to do something different here, or different here, or different here, any of those three sections, if I have a need to not start out at 0, maybe I want to start out at the midpoint, like the middle of the array. Maybe I want to go for 10 iterations. Just doesn't even matter the length. Maybe I want to, yeah, go in steps of 2 or halves or doubling or whatever I may do. If I need to do something different for any of those 3 parts, I'm going to fall back to that. So does that answer that? So there's a lot more cases than just the ones you mentioned, but it's literally if there's a reason to not have that version, then I would do that. That also includes things like, well, maybe I want to iterate not from the beginning of the array to the end. If I want to iterate backwards, go from the end to the beginning, I would do this. And that means when I'm using this, I'm kind of specifically telling the reader, something weird's going on, read this closer. You should take more attention to this because I'm doing something unusual, right? So if I'm just doing something normal, you need to pay attention to all those details. Good? So, not say you don't need to learn both syntaxes, but we're going to use this. This one is more preferable over the one before. Another little note. Beep, beep. Did anybody spot that difference? Why? What changed? So here I use const. Here I have to use let. I don't have an option. Here I have to use let.
So, because in the for loop on the bottom indexes, it already knows what indexes, which is just, however many items are in the colors array, so it doesn't need to, kind of try to figure that out with the, like this.
Not exactly. Not exactly.
Is it because in the for loop above, you're making the index, which is the let, do a bunch of different things?
Close. There's one part in here that forces this to be a let. It changes, right? And so because of this, that part, this has to be a let. So bear with me on that front. Because I'm changing this variable, I have to allow it to be a let. Okay. One of the downsides to that is then some unscrupulous developer can come in here and say index is 0, and this is now an infinite loop. It's just constantly going to hit the first index. Actually, it's going to hit index. Yeah, it's always going to go to index 0 and just loop continuously. Never end. So it's a little bit dangerous, right? It's a little bit dangerous because you can do that, okay? Generally, you want to avoid modifying the index as you're iterating through because it makes things behave very weird, right? It makes things behave very weird. If you change, like, okay, I'm iterating, and then jump to this point, and then iterate, and jump to this point, and iterate, those tend to be really hard to debug, okay? So it's really helpful for me to be able to make that variable const, okay? Because then I know that variable can't just be changing somewhere here in the middle of the for loop, right? Again, this is where if I want to do something weird, I go back here, okay? So I don't want to allow those kind of things, okay? So what happens is with this one, because I don't have any code that's modifying the index, it can be const, okay? But that gets kind of weird, okay? This variable is not constant. It's not constant, okay? First iteration through the loop is 0, and then it's 1, and then it's 2, okay? It's changing. It's changing. It's not constant, okay? What that const says is that I can't reassign it. Okay, so it's that I can't reassign it. I can't give it a new value. I can't go in here and say index is equal to 0. Okay, that's not legal because it's constant. In fact, a weird occurrence too, it is technically legal to put let there. You can. This would not have, setting index 0 here would not have the same effect as it does up here. Okay. So in this case, yours, if I set index 0 up here, it's changing where it is. It's actually changing that index variable. Thing here, this won't actually cause an infinite loop. Okay? So what's happening kind of under the covers with the for in loop is it's using something called an iterator. Okay? So when you tell it to do this, it says, okay, I need an iterator. So it asks colors, which is an array. It asks it for an iterator. Okay? And then it's going to use that iterator to track where it is in the array. So say, give me that iterator, and it continuously is asking for the next element from that iterator. Okay? Once the iterator says there's no next element, then we're done. Okay? So under the covers, this uses an iterator. Okay? And so out of kind of the merit of that, this index variable isn't actually telling it where it is in the array. Okay? So again, I'm going to go back to const. Okay, does that help any? One of my kind of fundamental rules of kind of modern development is you want to use const all the time and only use let in the very, very few exceptions that you can not get away with using const. Cool? Is everybody good with that?
So,
Yes.
since you're not actually changing it from anything, it's just changing in the background. That's why it's allowed.
It's basically a new variable every time I get through this loop. It's a new scope. That's the way to think about it, is it's a new scope. Here, as I'm looping, the index is kind of like there. It's the same index every time. Okay. Here, index goes away, get a new index. Index goes away, get a new index. The index goes away. It's actually reusing the same space in memory, so it's not additional memory space, but it's a new variable every time. It's a brand new variable. It's like the variable goes out of scope at the end of the for in loop, and then it comes back and has a new scope. Cool. Which is really, really helpful. Okay.
And is that because, by default, like arrays, they have an index, they have an index, but like a loop like that, it's just iterating it. It's like using like the iterator from the array, so it's not actually, it's like.
Yeah, it's not actually using this. Like, it's not doing colors brackets 0. It's actually using the iterator, and the iterator is saying, give me the next thing, give me the next thing, give me the next thing, give me the next thing. Which would also mean that things like it skips over elements that are not defined oftentimes. It can skip over those values because you haven't put a value there. It's like, okay, I don't need to look at that index because it wouldn't be interesting. Okay? That's what I remember. There's a link to it. Okay. So that's one version of it. Okay. Now I'm going to tweak this slightly, and I'm going to jump over to the for of syntax. And I wish I could fit all this into the same place, but I can't. So pops element, or maybe I say item. Okay. Difference between the for in and the for of is it gives me the element instead of the index. Okay. So when I go console log, I could log the item, but I actually don't know what index each of these elements are at. That's the main difference. Is you get here I get the item instead of getting the index. And in fact, there's no way to get the index. So I use this one for of when I don't care about the indexes. If I don't care about where it is in the array, I just want to go through each of the elements one by one, then I'm going to use for of instead. Okay, which actually is most of the time. Most of the time, I don't care a lick where it is in the array. I just want the elements. So this is usually the best solution. Most of the time, I'd argue 90% of the time, this is the easiest solution. Because I just want the elements, one by one by one. And that means I can do things like, hey, we have people in there, right? So I could just say, oh, I want just item dot first, right? If I'm using this for of loop. Whereas if I was using the for in loop, I would have had to say, go back and say colors or people, and say people. Maybe I do this as person. Let's say person. So iterate through persons, person, people, index. So if I'm using a for in loop, I end up finding myself writing these kind of things out. Versus if I use a for of loop, then oftentimes I can just do person.first. So it ends up simplifying the code inside the loop. Does that make sense? A lot of times using a for of loop will make the code inside quite a lot simpler. Okay. Same way as kind of versus this, right? Everybody good with that? So most of the time, there are these three different ways. Most of the time, I'm going to reach for this tool because most of the time it fits in that. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, if I find out that it isn't that case, and maybe I do need the index, okay, well, then I can follow up and use a for in. And if I find out, oh, I really need to do something especially weird, then I can go back to this. So I kind of have this tiered of like, for of is preferred. If I can't use for of, then I'll go to for in. If I can't use for in, then I'll go to for. Cool. They're really just about simplifying your code. All right. So let's get to these methods. So a lot of times, there are some algorithms working with arrays that are just really, really common. Okay, they're really, really common to work with. Okay. Actually, I think I need to go ahead and jump into VS Code at this point because this is going to be easier to write on the computer screen with some of the things I want to do. So bear with me as I make a switch and jump back over to my computer here. Okay. I'm going to make a new folder on my desktop, and I'm going to call this array examples. And I'm going to open that folder in code. So I've got a new folder on my desktop. There we go. And I'm going to make a new file here, and I'm going to call this find example .js. Okay. So I'm going to make an array first. And so let's say I make an array of people. Okay, and this is part of why I wanted to do this on VS Code, is because I want to start making an array with actually objects in it, and that would take a little bit more time to write on the whiteboard. Okay, so in terms of people, I might want to say, hey, what properties do these have? Maybe they have a first name, again, kind of going to what I did before. So first name, Paul, last name, Smith. Maybe I put another person in here and I call him John Smith. John Smith, and maybe we put in Mickey Mouse. Cool. So we have an array of people. Okay. So one person, maybe Paul Smith, one person named John Smith, one person named Mickey Mouse. So I've got an array of objects. Okay, so that's my starting point. So what I want to talk about here is what is the find method? So there's a method on the array, and what it does is it allows us to find an element, find the first element, that meets a set of criteria. And that set of criteria is known as a predicate. Okay, predicate. That's the way we're going to specify. So predicate is a function that takes an object and returns either true or false. Okay, function that returns an object accepts an object and returns true or false. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you how to implement this algorithm, and I'm going to tell you how, and then I'm going to show you how to use find, so you don't have to implement that algorithm. Okay? So first things first. So let's say my goal is to loop through this array, and let's say, hey, maybe the user has typed something in, right? So maybe they've said, I want to find the person with the name. Maybe I'm going to call this input. Input is equal to John. Okay. So they said, I want to find John and find all the information about John. Okay. So you can kind of think about this. They've typed it into some sort of search box, and we want to end up printing out all the information about John. Cool? Okay. So what I need to do is I need to search for and find that person. So I'm going to create another array, another variable. This one's actually going to be let because I know it's going to be changing. And I might say found person. So found person is initially null because we haven't found them yet. Okay, I'm going to loop through each of the people one by one, and what I want to do is I want to check, is this the person we want? Okay. Now, if I'm looping through all the people, do I need to loop through all? Do I need to hit all the indexes? Well, yes. Okay. So I don't need I don't need to do anything weird with my looping. Do I care about the index? Not really, because what I at the end want here is the object. Okay. At the end, I just want the object, and I don't care where it is. Okay. So I'm going to loop through using the for of. So const person of people. Okay. So we can loop through that one by one. And I can say that, well, what is my condition? Well, I want to find the person that has the first name that the user entered. Cool? Everybody good with that? So, all right. So I need an if statement. I say, well, what are my conditions? I want to say if the person dot first name is equal to the input, then found person is equal to person. Cool. So if I get to the end of this loop, if I found the person, that person object will be in the found person variable. And if it's not found, then the found person will be null. Everybody good with that? Pretty simple algorithm. We call this a linear search, because we're linearly searching through all the elements from the beginning to the end. Okay. And so I could, at the end of this, say, let's do a console log, and we'll log what we found. So found person. Okay. Now I'm going to run this. You may or may not have this installed, and you may have not talked about Node, but that's okay. Long story short, Node is a way to run JavaScript outside the browser. And so that's going to make this example really easy to do, because that way I don't have to hook up all the HTML and stuff to make this work. I can just run the JavaScript that I wrote here. So all I've got to say is node space and the name of my script. So it's find example.js. Run that there, and guess what? I found John Smith. It's what we'd expect, right? I can tweak this a little bit. So I can say, okay, well, let's look for Mickey. Okay, if I look for Mickey, run it again, and I found Mickey. So I can kind of think about, okay, all I'd have to do is hook up a different, hook that input up to a UI, and I could make this work, right? What if I try to look for somebody that doesn't exist? Jane. Okay, try to run that. Okay, cool. So we're getting null as we would expect. Okay, so let's say I change my mind and I want to look for people by their last name instead. Okay, so what code do I need to change if I want to say I want to find people by their last name? What line of code has to change? 15, right? And is there any other lines that have to change? No, just that one, right? So if I just change my criteria, I'm going to say, let's change that to last name. So we can kind of see all of the criteria is just this one line of code, right? So that's the last name. Let's look for somebody with the last name of Smith. Is that the result that we expected? I mean, he has a last name Smith, but generally speaking, I want to find the first result. There's two Smiths. Why did it find the second Smith?
Because it was the last name.
Right. So the first time it was true, we went through Paul Smith, and it says, okay, found person is equal to Paul Smith. The second time it went through and says, oh, this is also true for John Smith, so we'll save John Smith, the found person. Cool. So it's just saving the last result that we found. Kind of doing a lot of extra work, right? In fact, well, if the result we wanted was the first thing in the array, notice that this is still looping through the entire array. Okay. So oftentimes one thing we want to do is we want to shortcut, and we say as soon as we found the thing that we are looking for, break out of the loop. So break says stop the loop here. Break out of this loop. And so if I put that one line in, when I look for Smith, I'm going to find the first result instead of the last result. Everybody good with that? Okay. Do you see this now? All right. So you can write this out. You can absolutely do that. We could maybe further play around with this, and we could say, well, maybe we want to check if it's either the first name or the last name to be more general. I could say, well, if this is true, if the input is equal to the first name or the last name, that would let me do things like, hey, I want to look for Mickey. This would still work. It would just check if it's either one. Good with me? Yeah.
So whenever you go and you look at the last name of Smith, why didn't it show up John Smith and Paul Smith?
Because I've only got one found person variable, right? Every time I find somebody, I'm saving it to found person, and I'm overriding whatever was in that variable before, right? If I wanted to have multiple results, then I would need to save the results as an array. Okay? Does that make sense? So what I'm implementing here and working towards is the find method. Okay? There is another method called filter, which can do the other thing of getting all the results. Okay. Yeah. So there's two different methods that serve two different purposes. So oftentimes I may just want to find the first result because it's kind of the most efficient. It's the cheapest thing you can do, right? Finding the first result is pretty cheap, especially because I can break as soon as I find it. Cool? Okay. So this is so common that there's a method to do this exact thing in JavaScript with a lot less lines of code. You said what? Yep. Gets me out of the for loop early. So what I'm going to write instead of all of that is I'm going to instead say const, let's say again input, and again it's going to say const input is that. So what I can do is much simpler if I just know that, hey, there's this method called find in JavaScript. And so I can say const found person is equal to people dot find. Okay, and so what I want to find is the person I'm going to pass in this predicate. Okay, so my condition is where person dot first name is equal to the input. I'm going to have to push this down to 2 lines because that one's running along too far. And console, so I can just copy that over. Console log the found person. So if I just do that, oh, guess what? We get the same thing, right? So find loops through all the elements. Same code as above, actually. It's implemented using the same idea. But the difference is you supply this function. I supply a little function here that tells it what the criteria are, right? And so this is kind of the thing that we put into that if statement. Is we say, okay, what are your criteria? I want to say, okay, I'm looking for somebody with this first name. Okay, so taking a person, check if their first name is equal to input. If that's true, returns true, we get that element. And I could do a very quick change. If I wanted to say, let's look for maybe last name, and look for last name Smith. We're going to see, okay, great. Okay, there's Paul Smith. So very easy method to use. It's really powerful. Okay? Because it turns out that we do this very often. It's very often that you need to search through an array and find something, right? And so find allows you to do that. Everybody good with that? As a corollary to found person, it's also possible if you need it, there's a related method called find index. So if I wanted the index instead, you just call find index. It takes a predicate again. And let's call this found index. And I'm going to log both of those parts. General rule, don't do both, right? Don't do both find index and find because you're doing searches twice. It's twice as much work. But you can use whichever method you need, right? So if I do care about where it is in the array, I can use find index. That will give me the index. If I just care about the element, that's actually the most common case where you just care about the element. I can use find. So both of those methods are pretty helpful. Everybody good with that? Cool. Depending on what you need, right? Do you need the index? Do you need It's worth mentioning that what happens if we don't have an element that's found. So test, if I try to run that, we're going to find that, okay, find returns undefined because it didn't find it, and we get -1 out of found index if it's not found. So if we want to know whether or not it was found, we do have to check the result. Cool? Questions? Does that make sense? Find's pretty easy. Okay. Let's talk about the next one, which would be filter. Okay. So I'm going to make another file here. I'm going to call this filter example.js. I'm going to bring in over my same data, so I don't have to recreate it. So I'm going to have people again. Okay. And what I want to do is kind of define what this method is. So array.filter returns an array of all the elements that meet the criteria. Namely, again, the predicate. Cool. So it's a very similar thing where I'm going to ask for all of the results instead of just the first result. Okay. If we want to implement this ourselves, it kind of starts the same way. Okay. So I might say first, const input is Smith. I'm going to make another array. I'm going to make another variable. Const results is an array. Okay. So in the first example, I made it an object. Right? I said, let's look at just the first result that we get here. Well, now I want to get multiple results, right? So the return from this is going to end up being results. Cool? Okay. So let's say here, I want to go through again. I'm going to loop through const person of people. I'm going to loop through all the people one by one. Again, I need an if statement to define my criteria. So I'm going to say if person dot last name is equal to input. Then what I want to do is I want to say let's add that to the results. So I'm going to say results dot push. Let's push the person to the results. Okay. Now I can't break at this point because I want all of the results, and I don't know just because I found one result that I found all of them, so I have to continue going, right? With filter, there's no way to avoid that. And then at the end of this, I'm going to do a console.log, and I want to log the results. And I'm going to do results.join. Okay. Join is going to take the array and put it together into a string. And I'm going to specify that I want each of these elements separated by a comma and a space. Okay. So let's run this now. So node filter examples example.js. Okay. So we're going to see, oops, there's a little bit of a problem. I've got object. It's trying to run the two string methods of those objects. Let me just try to log results and see if it is any better. Results. There we go. So that's what I want to kind of see. So this is what we're trying to get to. Right? And you can see like the amount of code that I had to change to get multiple results isn't that different, right? I have an input I have some variable to store the results. I'm doing a for of loop. I've got an if statement. What's different is what I do inside of that if statement. That's really the only difference between find and filter. Between find and filter, in filter, you're going to push the results to the array, and otherwise you're just saving it to a variable. Okay. So that's the way we can implement this ourselves. But again, I want to show you how to use the function that's already built in. So same thing here. Take the input as Smith, const results is equal to people dot filter. And so what I want to say is here we're going to say person arrow, and then my conditions are that their last name is equal to the input. So person dot last name equals input, and again I'm going to push that down because there's a lot on one line. Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. There we go. And so we can then log the results. So I say, okay, here's my filter function. It's going to go through, check that, save results, right? And so then this makes it much easier to just kind of like, okay, well the only part that changes is this one is my criteria. I don't have to rewrite all that code anytime I want to get search results. I can do that. Cool? Everybody good with that so far? Do you kind of understand what we're doing? Okay. So find will give you the first result that matches your predicate. Truthful will give you all of the results that match your predicate. Difference being, filter always returns an array, and your find method is generally going to return an object. So let me try looking for Jane. So you notice if there's no search results, it returns an empty array. Cool. Okay, so that's the purpose of find and filter. Again, you can see that, hopefully you can see that these are really, really useful methods. Okay? All right, let's look at the next one, which is map. Okay, so map, and make a new file. File, map example.js. Okay. Again, it's a method of the array. So array.map. What it does is it transforms. It makes a copy. Makes it a copy of the array and transforms each element one by one. Okay, so it's going to get us to a new array, but that array will be different in some way, defined by our transform function. Okay, so reasons why you might want this. Right now we have an array of people. Maybe I want an array of names instead, right? Maybe I want an array of names instead of just people, okay? So that's what I'm going to do here, right? So I'm going to say, okay, const names is equal to an empty array. I'm going to loop through the elements one by one. So const person of people, and so I want to say names dot push, and so what I want to push over there is maybe their full name. Okay, so something like make a template string. You guys used template strings yet? Good. Okay. So what I want it to be here is their first name, space, and their last name. So we're going to make a template string with 2 kind of placeholders there. So this one's going to be person dot first name, and the second one's going to be person dot last. Okay. So go through each of the people one by one. I figure out what their full name is, add it to the names array, and then when I'm done with this, I should be able to do a console log on the names and have those names pop out. Very cool. So what it's letting us do is this kind of common problem that we run into is where we have one array and I need to turn it into another array of equal length. Okay. It's worth noting in math that always the input and the output have to have the same length. You can't start with an array of one size and come out with an array of a different size. That's where you use filter. Right? Filter is going to change or remove things from it. Cool. Okay. That's all you have to do to implement it. Again, coming back and showing how you can do this with the map method that's built in. Const names is equal to people.map. And so just like find and filter, it takes some sort of arrow function to do its work. And so the part that changes here, the part that's variable, is how I do the transformation, right? So the part where I'm doing the transformation is here inside of that array push, right? So just like before, it takes in an element. So it's going to take in a person, and it's going to transform it into that. So I'm just going to bring that all the way over. Input is a person, output is their full name. And then once we're done, I can log the names, and we should see that this has the same result. It does. Cool. So the point of map is to do a transformation again from one array to another array. It's a really easy method, right? But it encapsulates this algorithm. All of these map and filter and find encapsulate these algorithms that we literally use all the time, so that you don't have to write them all the time. That's it. It gives you some Lego bricks that you can put together of like, okay, rather than writing a for loop here, I'm just going to call this function. And it also gets you out of needing to like, here's a for loop, here's a for loop, here's a for loop, here's a for loop. I'm just going to call this function, and that will do the loop for me. So just like the for in and the for up are simplifications, right? They're simplifications of the larger counted for loop. They're an easier syntax. That's all this is, right? Find, filter, and map are just simplifications of writing your own loops. Okay? Cool. But we use them all the time. Okay? And when you guys get into React, which I think that's the plan for next week, these are things we use all the time. We do use find, filter, and map very, very, very often. Okay? Yes?
So this is like the first time that we're being taught like React, like the curriculum. So have you used like React?
So from that note, this semester is also the first time I'm teaching React. So I introduced React to my students in third semester about 3 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so we've been starting that journey. Okay, now we're building a more complicated project because we have a database on the back end. And in fact, the React application that we're building is connecting to the application that we built in the first 40 days of the semester. So it's a little bit more of a complicated project. And we're going more in depth in React than you guys probably will. Okay. So I'm kind of going through that journey where it's the first time I've taught it as well. I learned, and we kind of made the decision to potentially incorporate React probably about 2 years ago now, actually before COVID hit. And so I did some training back then, and so I've had some practice, right? So I've got a little bit of practice in reading that I've done over those 2 years, but it's something that I'm kind of new with, right? So I recorded my lectures when I did that first introductory thing with the shopping cart, and I think Evan's actually planning to show those recorded lectures on Monday. There's 3 of them because I did it at kind of over 3 days. That first introductory period, but yeah, so it's a new thing in the curriculum. It's something we're figuring out as we go. Okay. And there's also a lot of change in the React world too, so it's kind of sorting through that as well. Like there's been a big shift from what we call class components to functional components. Okay. But I'm trying to get you set up with some of the things you need to know about arrays before you get into that. Okay? So we've done a little bit of theoretical here. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and take these example files that I've written. I'm going to throw them up on your Discord server just so you have them. So if I go reveal in File Explorer, beep, 7-zip, and archive, array examples, I'm going to toss that up on Discord just so everybody has a copy of what we just went through. So if you want a copy of my code, there it is. Okay. So looking at your examples, we've kind of looked at how to do those things. I think maybe I want to do the next thing to do here would probably be to pull this back up. Is I want to send you guys on a break because we need to definitely do that. And when we come back from break, what I want to try and do is incorporate some of these things and kind of build an HTML page, a small application that incorporates maybe the find and the filter and the map and kind of puts them all into one example. Cool. So go ahead and take a, let's call it a 20-minute break. We'll come back at 10:15, and then we'll kind of play around with that and talk about what we want to do. So what I want to do here, I think kind of the easiest place to put a lot of these things together, and the easiest kind of context or application to put these things together is on like a search page. Search page is kind of the easiest thing. And it looks like some of you, that's kind of the direction you are going. It looks like the team that did filter and find, you're kind of going that direction. So that's the way I'm going to kind of go about this. Okay, it's to kind of build out a little bit of a search page. That means inherently I'm probably not going to use, I don't know that I'll necessarily be using find as much, but I'll definitely be using filter and map. And actually, I think maybe I know a way I can get find in there. So the caveat to that is that, well, a search page, you really can do anything. So give me some ideas about like what do we want to search, and we'll build it towards that. Cars? Okay, that's fine. We'll go for cars. So where I'm going to start is I'm going to make a new folder, and if you want to code along with this, please do. So I'm going to make a new folder here, and maybe you make this inside of your repo, so that you at least have it, so it's maybe something you can turn in or something. And let's follow this, the car search engine. I'm going to call that the name of the the folder, and I'm going to open that folder in VS Code. So usually, probably when you start your projects, you want a folder, you want some HTML, you want some CSS, you want some JavaScript. So I want to start by laying out those files. Okay. So I'm going to create a new file here. I'm just going to right click. By the way, it's worth mentioning, don't use these buttons. I would recommend against using these buttons that are up here, create new file and create new folder, because they end up creating them usually not where you would expect that file to be. So I would recommend doing a right click to create it where you want it. So I'm going to create them that way. So new file, index.html. Okay. Huh? So I'm going to do an exclamation mark and tab to get all of that stuff in there. Okay. While I'm here, I want to go ahead and add my header, car search engine, so that if I push this out to the internet, I don't want my clients to see, oh, the name of the page is document. We want to put a header in there, and maybe I'll put an H1 in there already. So H1 car search engine. Or maybe I should put, maybe we come up with the name of the dealership here. What do we call it? What do we want to call our dealership? Or we'll just leave this car search engine. That's fine. Okay, so I've got that in there. I want to create some CSS and some HTML, some JavaScript files. So I'm going to make a new file as well, and I'm going to say CSS/main.css. Please use these names. CSS/main CSS. You'll notice that I'm kind of putting a slash in there. Once you hit enter on that, you'll see it actually creates a CSS folder and puts main CSS inside that folder, which is a nice little trick that you can do. CSS main CSS, and new file here, js/main.js. So I've got main CSS and I've got main.js. There's nothing in them yet. We'll come back to those. All right. I want to link those in. So I'm going to add a link tag. Link rel style sheet. And I think it's href, isn't it? Href. It's been a while since I do these. So if I was to say, when you get into third semester stuff, you don't do this stuff as much. Oh, and it's complaining. Let me go ahead and add the script tag too. And source is js/main.js. Okay. Is anybody seeing a red squiggly on this like I am? Just by a show of hands. If you're seeing that red squiggly, put your hand up.
I think it's because of the
Okay. So you guys left it out. Okay. I want to leave it in. Okay. There's a recommendation here that's kind of telling us to pull it out. And that's actually the reason that that's coming in is there's a plugin that we've got installed called HTML Validate, and it's saying, oh, I don't want to do this. I kind of dislike that that's the default behavior of that validation plugin. That really shouldn't be that way. In fact, if I right click here and I go format document with, if I'm going to format this with Prettier, which Prettier is kind of one of the more popular formatting formatters now. Notice that Prettier chooses to go put in slashes at the end of all these empty tags. Okay. There's different views. For a while, we said when we were going down the XML route and HTML, we said, okay, these are going to be required. And then HTML5, we kind of backed off and said, they're optional. But so depending on what you're doing, is you may or may not want those. The problem here is just that HTML validates saying, okay, I have a certain preference about how that looks. Okay, I think actually you guys are in your repositories, right? Did you create the thing in your repository? Okay, so you should already have a bunch of rules that are preset if you're in the repository. I don't have those, and we've got those. So if you would do me a favor, let's take a look at what this is. Okay, I'm going to borrow from that and add my own file in there. I need to define something real quick here so that it tells it not to do that. npm HTML validate. I need to go to the documentation for that. And actually, that's what I want. New file. What was that file name? That file name was .htmlvalidate.json. New file .html. There we go. So I'm going to just quickly change the config. That's going to say that I actually want those that way. Cool. That's going to get the red underline. So anytime you see those things, your option is to fix it. Sometimes I find that I disagree with the roles, and so I may go kind of override and change the linting behavior. Cool. Back to here. Okay. So we brought in the HTML. We've got an HTML. We've got some CSS. We've got some JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and open this with Live Server so we can start seeing what's going on here. And so we should see something like this, which works. Okay, at least it's working. Looks ugly, right? Looks ugly because it's in Times New Roman, right? Because remember, Times New Roman is the default for the browser. It's been for a long time. What am I missing? Bootstrap, right? Okay, so I'm going to go grab Bootstrap. I'm going to bring that in. How have you guys been installing Bootstrap this semester? Okay. I would, just a heads up, I would really not recommend using this template. I mean, you can. I generally would not recommend using it. Partly just because I want some of those things that come in when I do the exclamation mark and tab. What I'm actually going to do, is I'm going to go over to a slightly different page that's up here. You see under Getting Started, this is an introduction. I'm actually going to go over to the download page. Okay. There's two options that I tend to use instead. The first option, and especially in first semester, is there's a compiled CSS, JS. You can go here, you can download. That will just give you all of the CSS and JS files. You can download it. That's one way you can go about this. Just download it, put it in your project. The other way that I do this, and this is kind of what's in the that starter template, is really these two lines. It turns out that's really all you need from the starter template, is those two HTML and the link and the script tags. So I generally recommend going that route, partly just because this works with whatever technology you end up using. If you're going to try and integrate this with React, you're going to have a hard time if you're used to maybe starting with the starter template. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. This is the piece that I want, and I'll throw this in Discord just so everybody has the same snippet that I'm pulling in is that link and script tags. And put a note on there that that's HTML, so it's syntax highlights. And so I'm going to pull those two things in here and format the document real quick. One thing you'll notice with this, which is kind of an important detail, is that I put the link in the scripts. Remember, before my own code. That's one thing just to remember is you want to make sure the bootstraps before your own code. That way your CSS can override and change how Bootstrap looks and on top of that. And you can also then you can call some of the Bootstrap functions from your own JavaScript code. If you get those out of order, then you can't do either of those things. Okay, so that's my goal. Okay, one thing I want to do now, so let's just check to make sure that it looks right. Cool. So we've got the text is changed. All right. So what I want to do is start to figure out how I want this displayed, right, and what the data is that we want to show. Okay. So remember we decided on, okay, we're going to be showing cars. Okay. So our cars need to have some data, right? We need to have some data about those cars, which is what we're going to use to build out our objects. Okay. So inside a car, what information do we need? What information would make sense? Okay. Model. That's make. What else? Color. Is there anything else that I usually capture in there with this pair? There's usually a 3 before I go to color.
Year, make, model.
Yeah. So it's actually usually make, model, and year in that order. Make, model, year. And then I can go to the color. The reason being make is the company that makes it, so it's the more general. Model is the model that company makes, and then year is the year that was made. So you're usually going to see the drop downs in that order. They filter down to the car that you want. Okay. So make, model, year, color. Anything else that you usually see about your car?
Like type, like if it's a coupe or sedan.
Yeah. So we might call that the body style. What else? The engine. Okay. Somebody else, give me a property.
Like miles.
Miles. Be like the odometer. Yeah, smart. You said what? Rams?
No, rims, like the wheel. Rims. Yeah, the wheels of the car.
Oh, rims. Okay. I heard an E in there. I'm like, rims. Can we call that something else? Maybe wheels?
Yeah.
Transmission, right? If I'm trying to go buy a car, I probably want to know if it's automatic or manual.
Like maintenance history, and accidents, stuff like that.
Okay. That's a good thing to have. That's usually a whole array of objects in itself, because there could be more than one accident, and each of those accidents has information. I don't want to go that deep today.
Yeah, probably.
So what else could we have in? It's just a simple like that. Features, okay.
That's kind of the
Trim, maybe. I think let's go with that. I think we have plenty there. In fact, I'm probably going to end up knocking a few things off. So let's see. Make, model, year. Yeah, let's just go with that. That's going to be plenty of enough information
Rebuild like the whole CarMax website or something.
Yeah, I don't want to go that far we've only got 2 hours, and I'd like to do this in 1. So let's start up at the top of main.js. And so what I'm going to start defining is an array of cars, right? Or array of vehicles, if I want to be more generic. So vehicles, okay. Inside of that array, I'm going to say, well, initially we want some data to go ahead and be in there, right? We don't necessarily want to start with an empty database. So I'm going to start populating with some cars. Okay, so make, model, year. So somebody give me a make, a model, and a year. Honda, Civic, model, Civic, and what year? '05. So 2005? Okay. And actually, I probably want that to be a number instead of a string. All right, what else? So let me push this. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do that there. So we need a color for this Honda. Call it just black. Okay, just call the data out here. Okay, color black, body style. I think that's a. Is that a sedan? One thing you'll notice, I'm starting to add all these properties. It's starting to get pretty long. So one thing I oftentimes do is I'll kind of right-click in here, and I'll say Format Document. I've already got it set up as prettier. That'll kind of pull it down. So oftentimes when you've got objects that have a lot of properties, it's usually easier to write them out this way, where it's like one property per line instead of an entire object per line. Okay, so we've got a body style of sedan. We have an engine. What kind of engine does this Honda Civic have in it? Is it a V6 or a V4? V4? What about miles? How many miles does this sedan have? 180? It's worth noting that the JavaScript for a very, very long time has not had any way to put 1,000 separator in. There actually is 1,000 separator coming in development for JavaScript. So at some point you will be able to write this as, say, 180_000, but I don't think that most browsers support it yet. So eventually you'll be able to do that, but it's not fully supported yet. So I'm going to leave that out. And actually this should be miles, not mile. Next up, wheels. What kind of rims does this have, Mark? Yeah, what kind of rims?
I'd say about 20.
20-inch rims, and what do they look like?
Chrome.
Okay, so maybe you say chrome 20-inch. I'm just going to put that into one field. The transmission, is this automatic or manual? Okay. And I'm going to put this in as just a single letter A. So I can do A or M. To try and abbreviate the data a little bit. Cool. All right, so that's one car. Let's go for car number 2. All right, again, I need a make, a model, and a year. Give me some information. BMW. Okay. Model. I8. Okay. What year? 2018. Okay. Color. Okay. We've got 2 black cars though. All right. Sedan. That's fine. That's fine. It's not a problem. What about body style? I'm miswriting these things. That's a sedan, isn't it? Or is it more of a coupe? Okay, so we'll say coupe. Okay. Tells you how much I know about cars. What kind of engine's in there? Okay. V6. And miles? Just come up with a number. 200,000. Wheels. Maybe I'll flip these and do the and the transmission. Just for data, I'm going to go ahead and just call it a manual, so that we have one that's automatic and one that's manual. Okay. I'm going to start with just that. In reality, you'd probably want to add a few more. I usually find kind of a minimum of 5 is really helpful for testing, but this is enough to get us up in the ground and running, and then you guys can kind of add some more data to it. Cool? Okay. So what I want to then do is we've defined the data that we have. I need to kind of capture and figure out how I'm going to display the UI. Okay, so oftentimes what I'll do is I'll step back from the code a second and go make a mockup. So what I want you to do is you should have had Balsamiq installed early in this semester. So look for Balsamiq. I'm going to go find that. I'm going to try and make a mockup for this project. Now, I've made a mockup for something else previously. So I'm going to go and I'm going to make a new project here. So new project. And so what I want to start to define is how this page is going to look. Okay. So I generally start with bringing in the browser here, right? So we've got a nice container about what that's going to look like. I want to keep it pretty narrow. So I'm thinking mobile first. And I want to add maybe a header. Okay. So I think we said this was a car dealership, car search engine. And this is going to be, maybe push it all the way up to, oh, that's too big. 32. Yeah, that's fine. So I've got a header. Okay. Now I want to think about what are the fields that I want to have on the search page. Well, I probably want an input where the user can type in some keywords. So input, there's a text input. I'm going to bring that in here. I'm going to say, well, maybe the first thing I want them to appear is something like that. Maybe I'm going to attach a little bit of a search button to the end. And maybe I want a little bit of a drop down with a label. Okay, so if we think about how we can filter this data, there's a few different fields in here that where drop downs might be helpful to, like, say, I only want some of the data, right? So I might do something like, hey, maybe we have a drop down for, let's just say there's a drop down for the make, and keep this simple. Do a drop down for the make. Do a drop down. I'm gonna copy that. Control C, make another label. So we got a drop down for the make. I'm gonna make a drop down for the color, and another one for the transmission. And oftentimes a kind of application like this, most of these end up having quite a few drop downs because there's a lot of things that you can filter by. So we've got the color, the transmission, and so this would be something like Honda and black. And automatic. So just making a really quick mock-up to kind of show what we're trying to build. Cool? Does that make sense, everybody? Oftentimes this is helpful to kind of plan things ahead of time before you get buried in the weeds of, like, I need to now write all the HTML and the CSS, and that can be difficult. And so it's just good to kind of know where you're going to go and kind of coordinate that with some non-technical people before you start diving into that. Okay. What else? I need to kind of define how the search results are going to appear. So I'm going to add in a rectangle. Rectangle. Beep. And so these are going to be the cars that come back, okay? In fact, I probably want to do them more like maybe a third of the screen or something like that. Okay. So what is the information that is, like, the most important when you're looking at these search results? Like, what's the stuff you need to see first and foremost? Maybe a picture of the car. If we had a picture of the car, that would be great. Notice that we didn't add any in our data, but we might need to add some there. So picture of the car might be good. Okay. So maybe make, model, and year, right? So what I might want to do, I'm going to add a label here. I'm going to stick that under there. I'm going to say maybe we want to show make, model, year as maybe one string at kind of the top. If I think about, other things that we commonly are looking for when we're looking for a car, like the transmission is pretty important, and you're usually looking for mileage too. I might also care about the color and other things like that, color and body style and things like that. But oftentimes the main defining factor is the transmission and the miles. Because it's like, well, oftentimes people will have a strong preference for a manual transmission or an automatic transmission. You don't even want to consider something that doesn't have that. So that's pretty important. So maybe I'll put those two in here, or some of those things in here. Maybe we do body and the body, transmission, maybe body, engine, transmission, something like that. Put those all on one line underneath here. This means this is going to kind of be a little bit wider. And then maybe the mileage would show up under here. So maybe I just start with that, right? Is capture some of the vitals, and then our goal would be, oftentimes what you see is you see these kind of search results come back, and then maybe you can click on it to find out more, right? To find out like a details page. So I don't know that we'll get to that details page idea here, but I want to get as far as I can with this. So it might look like the search results are kind of a grid. So I'm going to just kind of duplicate that a few times. Right. So this is our goal. Is everybody good with that? And so what I want to do is I want to use the things that we learned about arrays, that we talked about arrays this morning, and to try and implement this, right? And you should hopefully see that there's a lot of, you should kind of see there's some things you've talked about and kind of covered already previously in class that kind of tie in with all this. You should also see that maybe this ties in with some of the things you did with your little exercises that you did. Cool. It's just a little bit more fleshed out than those exercises that you did. Okay, that's our goal. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this to the folder. Where is my name car search engine? There. So I'm going to make a folder here, new folder, mockups, and I'm going to save that to my mockups folder. Oh, I didn't actually name it. Save project as. I want to say this as. I'm just going to call this as mockups. Yeah, replace it. Okay. So called that mockups. One thing I want to do oftentimes is name that particular screen. So here I'm going to say this is the search page. And then I'm going to export this to a PNG so I can have it in VS Code. So I'm going to say current mockup, export current mockup to PNG, search page. Yep, cool. And so when I come back here, right, so that's what I'm going for. And in fact, I can throw this into Discord so that everybody has a copy of it too. So that's what we're shooting for. Okay. So in order to get there, I need to start kind of laying out the basic structure of that page, right? So we can see up at the top, I basically have some sort of form where I've got a bunch of fields that you can use. And then beneath that form, that's where I actually have the search results. Okay. Now, initially, that search results section is going to be blank because we want to generate it from the data. Okay. So we're going to put the search interface in there. We're going to hard code that in. But the part where you see the actual items, that part we're going to generate from the JavaScript. So that's where you kind of see some parts of this page may be there initially when it loads, and other things load later. Okay. So, all right. So first things first, I'm going to add a form tag. Remember that you kind of need a form to start building out anytime you have inputs and things like this. So form tag is in here first. It's going to complain about it to me already because I don't have a submit button. That's okay. In there, I'm going to add a div for that first input. So the first input that we have is this search bar and the button. Okay, so I'm going to add a div to group those things together. And so here we have an input tag. And this is going to be type. Okay. Now, once I put in type, you'll see that there's a bunch of options. Okay. The most common type that you see in there is text. Text just says that you're typing in text. There is a special type in here, though, which I'm going to actually go ahead and use, called search. Okay. Search basically looks like a text input. The difference is that on mobile devices, it changes the keyboard a little bit. Namely, it will usually change the enter key to a little spyglass so that you know it's going to search when you press enter. So I use that for mobile purposes there. So this is our search input. I need to add some other things in here. So I need to, for instance, add a name, the name of this field. Maybe we say this is like the keywords, and the ID I'm also going to set to keywords. If I can type keywords. I also need to set a class. So for Bootstrap purposes, you want to set this to be a form control. That's going to help Bootstrap to style it nicely. I'm going to then add in my button using a button tag. This is going to be the submit button. So this is type submit. This needs an ID if I'm going to refer to it. So this is maybe btn search, and it's got the text of search. Okay. Now, one thing to remember from an accessibility perspective is that every input needs to have a label associated with it, because otherwise screen readers don't know what to do with that input. So you're seeing that this input doesn't have any sort of label, right? In fact, I didn't put one into the mockup. Remember, I didn't give a label for this. So what do? Well, one option is I could go ahead and add in a label and then hide it and make it only visible to screen readers but not visible to regular users. Or I can use a special property built into HTML called the aria-label property. Aria label. And so we're going to say this is keywords. Okay. That's important because, again, screen readers are going to use that. So because I don't have a label element associated with it, I'm going to go ahead and put an ARIA label on there, so at least there is a label as far as they're concerned. Everybody good with that? Easy fix. Yeah, so only screen readers will use that property. Only screen readers will use that property. So that's how I want to fix it for this one in particular. Next up, I'm going to add another div. Okay, and so that div is going to contain the next input that we have. And so you'll see the next input we have is the make. So I need a label and an input for that, or label and a select. So label, make. I need an select here, which is going to be my dropdown. And so this is going to be where the options go. Okay, so let's say we have some options, and by default, I want to show all makes. And then I may want to filter it down further and maybe only show some makes. So I might say here, okay, well, we've got Honda, I think we put in the data. So I'm going to give that as an option. So value is Honda and the text is Honda. And I'm also going to add one for BMW as well. I could easily extend this with more options. So say I want to add in a Ford. I could add in Ford there. One convention oftentimes is that you order these alphabetically. So I might move these around a little bit, namely move Honda to the end so that these are arranged from A to Z. Okay. Now, I do need to add some more properties here. So namely, I need to give this field a name of make, an ID of make, and I also need to give it a class, and so that class is going to be form select. So your form inputs get form control, and your form selects get form, and your selects get form select. This label, I also need to give it a class of form label. Okay, so form select, form class, form control. I'm going to go ahead and format this so you can see all the code that we're writing out. Okay. Another little thing I need to do in terms of accessibility. So if we look here, oh, I missed something. Notice my button is still in gray like here. I forgot to add classes to it. So class is btn primary. So we've got something like this. One of the things to notice here, if I click on the label, do you notice that kind of nothing's happening? Typically something should. Typically when you click on a label, it should act as a click onto the control itself. Okay, that's especially important for things like radio buttons and checkboxes. And what makes that happen is linking those two together using a combination of the ID property and the for property. So I need to say what label is what input does this go for? And so here I'm going to say for make, and that means that when I click on it, it's going to actually trigger a click onto the dropdown. See where it kind of blinks on there when I start to click on the label. That linkage is really, really important for screen readers. This may seem, adding for here might seem like a really minor thing to most of us, but if you're visually impaired, that is huge. That's really, really good. Cool. Okay, so we're starting with the layout step. The next drop down that we had was the color. So maybe I want to add that in here. In fact, I can probably duplicate this div because most of it's going to be pretty similar, and just change things over to be color. So color, color, color. Change the label to color. Change this. That's still going to be all. Maybe I do black, silver, and red. Black, silver, red. And oftentimes what you'll see is the value there over on the left is what we've got in the data versus what's here in the text is what we want the user to see. Oftentimes those will be different, right? Where one might be lowercase and the other is camel-cased and such, and vice versa. So I've got that drop down. And then I'm going to add my third drop down, which was for the transmission. So beep. This is the transmission. Transmission. And so here we've got M and A, which are manual and automatic. So you'll notice in all of these drop-downs, I'm choosing to have an option first that is everything and has a value of blank, because by default, what's pre-selected is always the first option in the drop-down. So I want to have, by default, selected all. If you look at the layout now, right, you should have kind of the field started to lay out. So we can look at what we've got. We've got an input box here. We've got a button. We've got a pair of 3 drop downs. Beep, beep, beep. But the layout's not great, right? The layout's not great because we haven't had a chance to kind of refine it yet, okay? So things we might want to do to kind of improve the layout and get it back to what we're targeting, okay? First things first, I might want to go ahead and maybe add some sort of border and some padding and some margins to kind of lay this thing out a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to the form, first of all. And on the form, I'm going to add some classes. And so I'm going to add like the class border, border dark, rounded, and padding 3. So what that's going to do is it's going to give us a nice dark border, rounded corners, and some padding to push everything in a little bit. And so if I look at that, we're going to be really close, okay? But you'll notice that the kind of the extent of that form still stretches all the way to the edge of the page. Do you see that? So I typically don't want that, okay? And the way we avoid that is by adding something we're kind of missing, okay? So with Bootstrap, oftentimes you'll want to have everything in a container. That's going to push everything in from the edges. And so I need to add that in. The thing here is I really don't want the form to be the container. I actually want the container to contain everything on this page. I could go and just say that the body is the container, but oftentimes I find that I want some things in a container and some things not in a container. So I usually apply that to another tag, okay? Now, what we have here so far is really the entire main content of the page, right? I don't have an nav bar, I don't have a footer, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just wrap everything that we have so far in a main tag. So I'm going to say main starts here, and I'm going to take that end tag, cut it, and I'm going to move it all the way to the end of the form. So both the form and the H1 are contained in main. And I'm going to give this main the class of container. So if you have all that, you should just have a nice little form that looks like this. Okay. I still need to do a few things to kind of set things up. I want to remember when we looked at the mockup, one of the things that I wanted to do is I didn't want the button to be underneath the search box. I wanted it to be to the right of it. So everybody see that? I want it to be to the right of it. So Bootstrap's got this really nice control called an input group. And an input group allows you to combine labels and inputs and buttons and selects all into one line. It looks all like one input. And so that's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to use what's called an input group. And an input group's really easy. I've actually kind of laid the groundwork for it already. So I just go to this div that contains those two things, and I'm going to add the class input group. Cool. So it just takes everything that's in there, the input and the button, and puts it all in one nice line together. Oftentimes, you know, button primary is really good when you're having like submit buttons at the end of forms and things like that. I often find though that button primary doesn't look all that good here. It's usually not the most user-friendly thing. So one of the things that exists in Bootstrap is they also have these outline styles for buttons. They work really well with input groups. So I'm going to do btn outline primary. I'll show you what this looks like. So btn outline primary is going to give it this nice outline, and when you hover over it, then it becomes filled. I usually find that that looks a little bit better with these input groups, but you can really do it either way. That's a give and take what your preference is. You know, do you want it to be an outline or do you want it to be a primary style? or filled in style, solid style, either of those work, but I oftentimes prefer the outline style. Cool. Okay. Last thing that I forgot to do is if you pay really close, last two things I forgot to do. If you pay really close attention, you might notice that all the fields are very close together. In fact, like transmission is butting up right against color. That label is right next to the field, which actually is kind of confusing to the user because you usually expect the label to be closest to the field that it goes with, right? And right now that's not true. Transmission is closest to the color input, color is closest to the make input, and so it's very kind of visually noisy. So one of the things I do, and this is why I've added those divs in already, is on each of these div where I have like the label and the select, I'm going to add the class MB3, MB-3. That says I want a little bit of margin bottom at the bottom of each of these fields. Specifically, it's one rem, like one character height. And so I'm going to add that to all of these three divs. Doop, doop, doop. And on that note, I also want to add it to the top one so that there's some spacing underneath the input group too. So all four of those divs are going to get a little bit of MB3. It's going to space these out a lot nicer, and then you can tell what the labels go with. Cool. Kind of just design and setting things up. So that's usually part of how I set up my forms. Is I'll do MB3 labels or select, label and select, or label and input, and to kind of move these things. Okay. Last piece. Have we reached and made the top part of this? Is it looking like our design yet? Why not? You're shaking your head.
Does the three drop downs are like vertical?
They're still vertical, right? So that's the last thing from the top part that we need to fix, is just fix the top part so that those things are horizontal. Anybody have any ideas?
Grid.
You said grid. What's your idea?
You just put them in rows and then.
Okay, so you said grid. Hands up. You said what? You got a hand up.
Oh, no, I'm fine.
Okay. Flexbox, right? I could go either route, right? Flexbox, grid, either of these are options here. Okay? So remember, grid is really good when you have things nice and structured where you want to do like halves and thirds and fourths. Okay? And that's an option here, right? That is absolutely an option here. I could say, let's use grid. And inherently, that would mean that this takes up a third of the space, a third of the space, a third of the space. I can do that. But do all these three fields need to be the same way? Should they be the same way? You say yes. Why?
Just keep playing on the page orderly.
Okay. Is the length of like make, model, and color of the strings that go into those dropdowns going to be all the same length now? Okay. So the reason that I call that out is because if I make them all the same width, I'm actually potentially wasting a bunch of space that I could be using for more inputs. Because remember, these are just the three I decided to do, right? I didn't include here things like model and year or body style or wheels or engine that you might also want to have as dropdowns, right? So in reality, you're probably going to have much more than just three dropdowns here. If I could fit more of those onto one line, I think I would like to, right? So I could totally do this with grid, but I'm going to choose to do it with Flexbox so that they can be different ways. Okay? That's a give and take, right? That is a give and take. That is like, hey, if you really do want a uniform width, then grid is really good about that. But if you need things to be a little bit more fluid, then flexbox is better. Okay. So I'm going to take the flexbox out for this. So what I'm going to do on here is I want to take those 3 inputs and put them into a flex container. Where do I put the flex container? Well, I need to put it, like, what element gets the flex container, becomes the flex container? Okay. Remember, the flex container isn't the individual divs, right? This can't be the flex container because it has to be the thing that contains all the dropdowns, right? Yeah, I have to introduce another div because I don't want to include the search box up the top. So I'm going to wrap another div around here. It would turn out, even if I wanted to do this with grid, I would need to introduce the same div where this would be the row and these would be the columns. So either way, you're going to introduce another div. But this is where I need to put that container. So class dflex. Okay, so that's going to change the display type to flex. And I want to go ahead and take a look at what immediately does that do. Actually, it's really close, right? Just adding display flex, we're very, very close to what we want to be, right? We're very, very close to it. And you're seeing that, like, for instance, the transmission field is a little bit wider, mainly because of the label on top of it, right? But it's gone ahead and allowed those to be whatever width is appropriate for the dropdown and the options in that dropdown. Okay. The only issue that I need to resolve is that they are appearing really right up next to each other, right? There's no space between the individual items. But that's an easy thing. That's an easy thing. You may have learned a little bit about alignment. You could try to use that. The problem is I don't want the alignment to really be evened out per se. What I really just want to do is create a little bit of space pushing them apart. So I'm actually going to do something a little bit easier than that, is just say, let's add maybe an ME2. And if I add an ME2 for that first div, that's just a little bit of margin right. And so that's going to space them out. So that's really all I need to do, is add a little bit of margin to the right of each of them. Done. Easy fix, right? Again, I could have done this with grid. If you wanted it to be uniform and you wanted them to be thirds, that'd be great. But if I don't, then I'm going to do this. Let me go ahead and check how this looks on mobile. So I'm going to go into my DevTools, and I'm going to try and look at this here. And dock my console to the right. And maybe look at this on iPhone 5. So actually on the iPhone 5, this is looking pretty good, right? Looking pretty good. I think maybe there's enough space there. Let's just check the drop downs to see. Beep. Probably. It's worth noting though, however, usually what I find on mobile is that this kind of works, but I may want to go ahead and drop things to be entirely vertical. Do you have a hand up? Okay, I'm just stretching. Cool. So one thing I may want to do is just a quick tweak is to make sure on smaller devices that still appears vertical instead of horizontal. So all I need to do is go back here and say, let's call this a flex column. Let's go back here. Okay, cool. Thing to remember though is flex column says that it's always a column, but I have to work in a mobile first mindset. So I say, okay, on small devices it's a column, and then flex, maybe let's try medium, flex MD row. What that should get us is on small devices, it's there, and eventually it jumps up. Now, I think maybe I can do it a little bit sooner. I think maybe I can try this small. Let's see how that works. There we go. Yeah, that's pretty good. So my breakpoint, I'm going to end up putting that one at small because I can. So quickly set up. Awesome. We've got things responsive. Okay. Cool. Okay. So we're kind of running. It's taking a bit to get here to get these things set up. So we need to kind of run through starting how do we take the JavaScript and how do we turn it into and how do we update the HTML. Okay. So I need a place at the end of this page, right? So I've got the form all in here. After the form, I need to carve out a space for the results. So I'm going to create a div here. This is going to have ID of search results. So I can target it with my code. And maybe initially it just says loading. Okay. I might want to go ahead and just intuitively take a look at it. You'll notice that loading's appearing right next to the border. So I know I need to add a little bit of margin on the bottom of the field. So I'm going to do a quick MB3 there just to push the search results away from the form. Okay. So that's kind of our setup, right? That's our setup. And now we can start looking at the JavaScript, right? Now that we've got some HTML to kind of set up and sketch out what we want to be there, I can start looking at how am I going to use the code to populate the search results, okay? So in the code, all right, so we've got this array of vehicles that we've defined up top. Remember that we want to postpone whatever JavaScript that we're running until the DOM is loaded. So we're going to say document dot add event listener, and you guys were adding that to DOM content loaded, right? And I forget the capitalization on that. So MDN DOM content loaded. There we go. Beep. DOM content loaded. Give it a nice little arrow function to tell it what we want to do. So when the page is loaded, right, what I'm trying to do first and foremost is try to populate that search results area with some results. Okay, so first things first, let's go ahead and grab the search results element. Or maybe I call that the search results div is equal to document dot get element, or sorry, dot query selector. Query selector, and so I want to go select it by the ID. So search results. Now, one thing that's might stick out to you if you're kind of paying attention to some of the stuff we talked about. You see this document query selector? It's kind of going and finding something by ID. It's actually very similar to the array.find method that we were just talking about. In a lot of ways, the code behind query selector is very similar. And query selector all is very similar to how filters implemented because it can return multiple results. Okay, so I want to get the search results, and then what I want to do is I'm going to effectively, I kind of want to go through the results, the items one by one, and generate HTML that I can then show in the page. Cool? Everybody good with that? Which actually kind of turns out that it's kind of like a map, right? It's kind of like a map because I want to transform the vehicles into HTML. So this is actually a place where I can go ahead and start using map. So I can say, okay, what I want to have is maybe, let's just call this cards is equal to vehicle, or maybe vehicle cards. Vehicle cards is equal to vehicles dot map. And so what I want to go through is go through each vehicle one by one and transform it into something else. So namely what I want to transform it is into some HTML. So I'm going to say, well, let's turn this into, actually I don't want curly braces there. I don't know why I added curly braces, probably out of habit. I want this to go to a template string. That's what I want to have here. And so we're going to say, in terms of this, I want a div and a div. And inside of that div, I want to have maybe another div. So this is going to be kind of the top line of that information. And so this is maybe vehicle dot make the vehicle dot model and the vehicle dot year. So I can start by doing this. So I'm going to transform, again, I'm transforming the vehicle objects into these elements, right? I'm using a template string to transform them into a string. Now what I can then do is go through each of those cards and kind of add them to the DOM, right? So I can say, all right, in the search results div, I want to go through, I want to add these things in. So maybe we go to search results div. Actually, maybe I need to loop through. Might have to loop through. Yeah, I think I still find myself looping through this list. Maybe I'll do it this way. Maybe I'll do it a different way. So I'm going to say, now I got the vehicle cards, I'm going to say dot for each element in there. Card. I'm going to say search results div dot, I think it was append child. Append child, and I'm going to append the card. That should give us something cool here. Okay. Now, maybe I just want append. Maybe I just want append. Oh, there we go. That's something. But it's writing it as just a string. What if I do MDN DOM append HTML. Why was append child not working? The node adds a node to the end of the list. Okay, I think that's maybe what I need to do, is I may need to turn these into document fragments. Or DOM string. Can I turn this into, where are my lists? String, document fragment. MDN, HTML, 2 elements. Because I know there's a way to transform what I have into there. It's just been a while since I did this without. I'm like, how do I do this with React and jQuery, which I'm very used to using both of those. Maybe I'll just do maybe I'll just use the other, maybe I'll just do this for now, because this will work for me. So I'm going to do inner HTML plus equals the card, and just add it that way. I don't know that that will work for everything we want to do, but at least it should work for the moment. There we go. So you'll see, right, after loading, it's giving in Honda Civic and the BMW, which is kind of from the data that we pulled out. Okay. One gotcha is that I probably don't want this loading to stick around, right? I probably want to go ahead and get rid of that. So I need to remember to clear that out, right? So before I start adding things in, I need to say maybe search results, inner HTML, and reset that back to just blank. And in that way, there won't be anything in there to start with. Now, in order for this to look a little bit better, I want to add some additional classes to the HTML that we're rendering. So, namely, I want to give this a class of card, MB2. So it's going to make it look like a card with the border and MB2. And I also need to put the content in the card inside of another div, because I need another div for the card body. So class card and class card body. There we go. That's starting to look like something. Okay. If you're looking at our mockup, remember we also added in the body, the engine, the transmission, and the mileage. So I want to do that here as well. So I'm going to add that as another line. And what was that? Body, engine, transmission. So body style, engine, transmission, and another div underneath there is going to be just the miles. So that should get us to something like this, which is better. It's not fully where we want to be yet, but it's sort of a working towards that. Okay. One thing I commonly want to do is I want to render things like the body style, the engine, the transmission. I commonly end up rendering these things as, say, badges, which is a really helpful element in Bootstrap. So I'm going to push these things down So I can kind of start setting this up. Because what I need to do is I need to put each of these pieces into a span. Slash span, 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 span. And I'm going to give all of these the classes, class, badge, BG primary, that's going to start making things look a little bit better. You'll notice that the transmission is still being shown up as A or M, so I still need to do a little bit with that, but you're starting to see how it looks. Another thing I need to do with the styling is I want to make this top part of the text usually a little bit bigger. So for that top line, push this down a little bit. So I have room for the classes. I'm going to say this is a class. Maybe this is a card title. This is the title of the card, and this is an FS2. Okay, so font size 2, making it kind of look like an H2. For the text on the bottom, I might say the mileage. We want to de-emphasize that, so I might want to do text muted, which is going to gray it out a little bit. So we're starting to see I can kind of lay some things out there. There's a little bit of spacing between, more spacing between the header and the and these badges that I may want, so I might want to move a few things around. So I might want to add MB1 here, and here class MB1 to adjust the space, or just MY1 there for top and bottom. There we go. So we got things spaced out a little bit better. Okay. So you're seeing the map, right? The map can be very useful for transforming things from one array to another. So in this case, I'm transforming it from an array of vehicles to an array of elements, right? To an array of cards. I can go in here. It's worth noting that this is in expression land, like we're in the middle of a template string, so all I can put here is expressions. If I want to change this so that the transmission shows up as either like automatic or manual instead of M or A, I can't use an if statement because I don't have the ability or access to statements within here. But I can use ternaries. Everybody remember working with ternaries? It might have been a while. Okay. So one of the things I want to do is I want to put in here, I'm going to push this down again. And so I'm going to say if the transmission is equal to A, then I want this to render as automatic. And then otherwise, I'm going to check if it is M, render it as manual, and if it's neither of those, I'm just going to go ahead and render the thing. So if I use that sort of structure, what you're going to see is it now renders as automatic or manual instead of M or A. So oftentimes we kind of use these ternaries to incorporate sort of like if statements in the middle of an expression. Cool. All right. So we've talked about how to do the map. Okay. What I want to then do is say, well, what if I don't want to show all of the cards, right? What if I just want to show some of the cards, right? Remember that I can use filter to change what search results appear. So for instance, in this chain, I can say this is vehicles. I can say, well, let's filter it first. Right? Let's filter down the list before we map it. So maybe I filter it first and then I'll map it second. So this takes in a vehicle. Maybe I say, well, I only want Hondas. So I could say, hey, let's only pull in vehicle.make is equal to Honda. Okay. So this is going to end up showing just the Hondas. Not all the cars anymore, just the Hondas, right? Because I filtered and said I only want those search results. So I can combine both the filter and the map functions, and if we look at it now, well, the other car's gone, right? In fact, I can kind of test this just to make sure that we're not crazy and it's doing the right thing. If I change this one real quick to be a Honda, we're going to see, oh, it's back there, right? So it's not showing because it's a BMW, right? Okay, so that's one of the things I can do with this, is I can use that filter to control, right, what is visible. Cool? Okay, so that's your starting point, right? This is your starting point. And so I think with the little time that we have left, what I want you to do is take kind of what we've covered, right, and turn it into something that where actually the things that you've taken in the form control what the results are doing. One piece I might give you before I completely set you loose to that is you're going to probably want to make a function, right? You're probably going to want to make a function to group some of this logic together, right? So I'm going to add a function in here. I'm going to say function show search results. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this code that's in here right now, cut it, and move it over to this show search results function. Okay. And so I want that function to be called from DOM content loaded here once. But you're also going to want that called when you click on the button. So when you click on the button, I might want to say document.querySelector. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to say, what do we want to select? I think I called what is the button's ID? The button's ID is BTN search. Okay, BTN search. So we've got this show search results function. I've got in here, it's going to run initially. So this is going to run it when the page loads. And I also want to run it when you click the button. So BTN search dot add event listener. Take in the event, and what I want to do is I want to say dvt.prevent default first of all, and then I'm just going to call show search results. So show search results gets called when the page loads, but also in response to you clicking the button. Okay. So basically all you have to be found is that show search result function. You're probably also going to want to hook up some event listener to say, hey, when the drop-downs change, then trigger the search, right? Or, you know, things like that. Cool. So go for it. I'm going to go ahead and take this, zip it up, throw up what we got. just in case you missed any part of that. But this is kind of what we're working towards.